The woman I thought I knew for 47 years was a stranger, and I only discovered this 6 months after I buried her. I'm 74 years old, and my name is Tom Hendricks. For nearly 5 decades, I woke up next to Margaret, shared coffee at the same kitchen table, watched our 3 children grow into adults with children of their own, and believed, truly believed, that I understood the woman who wore my wedding ring. We were the couple people envied. At church socials, friends would joke about our secret to a lasting marriage, and I'd smile and say something simple like, patience and compromise. And Margaret would nod and squeeze my hand, and everyone would sigh at how perfect we were. Perfect. That word haunts me now because perfection, I've learned, is just another word for blindness. It was a Tuesday morning in October when my world fractured, though I didn't know it yet. The attic had been calling to me for months, that dusty space above our bedroom where Margaret had stored 47 years of accumulated life. 6 months had passed since the funeral, and our daughter Sarah had been gently suggesting I needed to start going through things, not pushing, just leaving it hanging in the air between us like she always did when she thought I was being stubborn. I'd been avoiding it, if I'm honest. Every box up there was a memory, every item a small death, and I wasn't ready for more death. But that Tuesday, I woke with a strange determination, the kind that comes when you realize avoiding something hurts more than facing it. The attic smelled like old wood and lavender, Margaret's scent, and the sachets she'd made and tucked everywhere because she said our memories deserved to smell beautiful. I stood there in the slanted morning light coming through the small round window, surrounded by cardboard boxes labeled in her perfect cursive handwriting, Christmas ornaments, baby clothes, and tax records 1985 to 1990. Such an organized woman, my Margaret. Everything in its place, everything labeled, everything controlled. I started with the box nearest the window, working methodically the way I'd always worked, the way I'd spent 40 years working as an accountant, everything in order, everything making sense. But life, I was about to learn, doesn't file neatly into labeled boxes. I spent 3 hours sorting through Christmas decorations and old tax returns, making piles for donation, for keeping, and for our children to decide about. Ordinary things. Safe things. Then I pulled over Margaret's craft chest, the large wooden trunk she'd kept in the corner of the attic for as long as I could remember. She'd been a crafter, my wife, always knitting or scrapbooking or doing some project that kept her hands busy while we watched television in the evenings. I'd open the chest, sort through yarn and fabric and whatever else was in there, and be done before lunch. Simple. The chest was heavier than I expected, and something shifted inside as I dragged it into better light. I unlatched the brass clasps, the metal cold under my fingers, and lifted the lid. Balls of yarn in every color imaginable, knitting needles, embroidery hoops, and patterned books with dog-eared pages. I started lifting things out, setting them aside, and that's when I noticed it. The bottom of the chest looked wrong, too shallow, like there should be more depth. I ran my fingers along the edges and felt it give slightly. A false bottom. My heart started beating faster, though I couldn't have told you why. Margaret wasn't a secretive person. Margaret had breakfast at 7:30, grocery shopping on Thursdays, and phone calls to the kids every Sunday evening. Margaret was predictable and steady and exactly who she appeared to be, which was one of the things I'd always loved about her. No drama, no surprises, just comfortable companionship growing old together. So why did my hands shake as I pried up that false bottom? Underneath, wrapped in faded purple cloth, was a leather journal I'd never seen before. It was worn, the leather soft and cracked with age, dark brown with no decoration except Margaret's initials embossed in gold on the bottom right corner. I held it in my hands, and something in my chest tightened because this wasn't like the journal I knew about, the one with flowers on the cover that she wrote in every morning at the kitchen table while her coffee went cold. That journal was for grocery lists and doctor's appointments, and little notes about what the grandchildren were doing. That journal she'd shown me entries from, reading aloud funny observations or sweet memories. That journal was public, shared, and part of the life we lived together. This journal had been hidden. Which meant this journal was private. Which meant this journal held things she didn't want me to see. I should have closed it. I should have put it back, respected her privacy, and honored the boundaries she'd so carefully constructed with that false bottom and purple cloth. A good husband would have done that. But grief does strange things to the living, and I missed her so desperately that the chance to hear her voice again, even in written form, even in words she never intended me to read, was too powerful to resist. I told myself I just wanted to feel close to her again. I told myself she was gone, so what did privacy matter now? I told myself a lot of things that morning in the attic, justifications that fell apart the moment I opened the first page. The first entry was dated August 14, 1978, 3 years after we married. Margaret's handwriting, unmistakable but younger somehow, more passionate in its loops and curves. "I'm starting this journal," she wrote, "because I need a place that's just mine. Tom is a good man, a provider, solid and dependable, everything my mother said I should want in a husband. But sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing into being his wife, and I need somewhere to remember who I was before, who I might still be underneath." I read those words 3 times, trying to understand what they meant, trying to reconcile them with the woman who'd seemed so content in our life together. She needed somewhere to remember who she was? What did that mean? I was right there. She could have talked to me. But she didn't, did she? She wrote it in a hidden journal instead. I kept reading, compelled now by a growing unease I couldn't name. The early entries were innocent enough, observations about wanting to take an art class or wishing we talked about more than household logistics and bills. Small frustrations that every marriage has, nothing alarming. I could handle this. This was normal. Then I reached entries from the mid-90s, and a name appeared that made my blood run cold: Daniel. Daniel worked at the library where Margaret had taken a part-time job after our youngest started high school. I remembered him vaguely, a friendly guy I'd met once or twice at library functions, tall with graying hair and glasses, harmless. Margaret mentioned him occasionally, the way she mentioned all her coworkers, nothing that raised any flags. But in these journal entries, Daniel wasn't just a coworker. Daniel was someone who asked Margaret about her dreams. Daniel was someone who recommended books he thought she'd love. Daniel was someone who told her she was brilliant and funny and wasted in a small-town library. Daniel saw her, really saw her, in ways she wrote that I hadn't seen her in years. My hands were shaking now, the journal trembling as I forced myself to keep reading. There was no affair, at least not in the physical sense, but what I was reading felt worse somehow. An emotional intimacy I never knew existed. A connection where she felt understood and valued for her mind and not just her role as my wife and our children's mother. She wrote about conversations with Daniel that made her feel alive again, about how he listened when she talked about ideas instead of just nodding and changing the subject back to practical matters. She wrote about feeling guilty for looking forward to her library shifts, about the knot in her stomach that was equal parts excitement and shame. And then I reached the entry that made me stop breathing. May 2nd, 1995. Daniel asked me to leave Tom today. We were shelving books in the back room, and he just said it, no preamble, no building up to it. "Leave him, Margaret. Come with me. We could move to Portland, start fresh, be who we really are instead of who everyone expects us to be." I stood there with a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt in my hands, and I couldn't speak because part of me wanted to say yes. God help me, part of me wanted to say yes. The attic spun around me. I had to set the journal down and put my head in my hands because I thought I might be sick. May 1995. That was the year we'd celebrated our 20th anniversary. I'd surprised Margaret with a weekend trip to the coast, and she'd cried and told me she loved me, and we'd renewed our vows on the beach with just the two of us and the sound of waves. I had the photos in an album downstairs. Margaret in a white sundress, holding my hands, tears streaming down her face, and I'd thought those were happy tears. I'd thought I knew what those tears meant. But according to this journal, that was the same year she'd been contemplating leaving me for another man. I picked up the journal again with hands that didn't feel like my own and kept reading through entries I both needed and dreaded to see. Margaret wrestled with the decision for weeks, with pages and pages of agonized back and forth. She listed reasons to stay: our children, our history, the life we built, and the fact that I was a good man who loved her in the way I knew how. She listed reasons to go: feeling suffocated, intellectually starving, trapped in a role she'd never quite fit into, and the chance to finally be seen as a whole person instead of just a supporting character in someone else's story. My story? She was the supporting character in my story, and I never once considered that she might want to be the protagonist of her own. The final entry from that period was dated June 17, 1995. "I'm choosing to stay," she wrote. "But I need to be honest about what this choice costs. I'm choosing security over possibility, comfort over passion, and the known over the unknown. I'm choosing our children's intact home, Tom's heart unbroken, and the life everyone expects us to continue living. But I'm also choosing to bury who I might have been, and Tom will never know how close he came to losing me. Daniel gave me 2 weeks to decide, and when I told him I was staying, he transferred to the branch across town. We haven't spoken since. I need to make peace with this decision and need to find a way to be content with the choice I've made. But right now, all I feel is grief for the life I'll never live." I sat in that attic, 74 years old, reading words my dead wife wrote 28 years ago, and I felt the foundation of my entire life crack beneath me. The marriage I thought was rock solid, the partnership I believed was built on mutual contentment and shared goals, and the love story I told myself and our children and anyone who asked, it was all built on a decision Margaret made that I never knew she was making. She stayed, yes, but she stayed while mourning the person she might have been without me. She stayed, and I never knew she'd almost left. She stayed, and I never thought to ask if staying was killing something inside her. But here's what terrified me most as I sat in that dusty attic with her hidden journal in my lap. If Margaret kept a secret this big, what else didn't I know? If she could contemplate leaving me and I never saw a single sign, how blind had I been? How many other moments had I missed? How many silent struggles had I been oblivious to? And how many times had my wife needed me to ask the right questions and I just kept living my comfortable, predictable life, assuming everything was fine because she never complained? I looked at the journal in my hands, and I realized I was only a quarter of the way through it. There were decades of entries left to read, decades of Margaret's private thoughts and hidden life. And I knew with a certainty that felt like drowning that everything I was about to discover would change how I understood our entire marriage. The woman I'd loved for 47 years was a stranger. And she'd been a stranger the whole time, right there beside me, and I'd never known to look for her. So I'm asking you now, before I tell you what else I found in that journal, before I reveal the full truth that broke me, how well do you really know the person sleeping next to you? And if you discovered that everything you believed about your life together was only half the story, would you be brave enough to read the rest? I didn't leave the attic that day. I couldn't. My daughter Sarah called around 2 in the afternoon, her voice cheerful on my cell phone, asking if I wanted her to bring dinner over, and I told her I had food in the fridge, which was a lie because I hadn't been to the grocery store in a week. I told her I was fine, which was a bigger lie, and after she hung up, I turned off my phone completely because I knew if she called again and heard my voice, she'd know something was wrong. Sarah inherited her mother's ability to read people, to sense the tremors beneath calm surfaces, and I couldn't face her questions. Not yet. Not when I didn't even understand what I was feeling myself. So I sat there on the attic floor with my back against an old trunk full of winter clothes, and I kept reading my dead wife's secret journal as the afternoon light shifted to evening shadows, and with every page, the woman I thought I'd married dissolved a little more, replaced by someone I was meeting for the first time at 74 years old, too late for any conversation except the one I was having now with words she'd written in private, never intending for my eyes. The entries after Margaret's decision to stay with me were different in tone, more resigned, and more careful. She wrote about building a life within the boundaries she'd chosen, about finding small rebellions and quiet joys that I knew nothing about. In September of 1995, just 3 months after she turned down Daniel's offer to leave with him, she wrote about discovering a pottery studio 40 minutes away in the next town over. She'd seen an advertisement in the library newsletter, something about beginner classes on Saturday mornings, and on a whim, she told me she was going to a new book club. I remembered those Saturdays. I'd been playing golf, happy she'd found a social activity, never once suspicious because why would I be? Margaret didn't lie. Except she did. Every Saturday for 3 years, Margaret drove to that pottery studio and learned to throw clay on a wheel, to center and pull and shape earth into something beautiful with her own 2 hands. She wrote about the first time she successfully made a bowl, how she'd cried in the studio because it was hers, something she'd created that had nothing to do with being a wife or mother, something that existed purely because she wanted it to exist. She wrote about the instructor, a woman named Linda who treated her like an artist instead of a hobbyist, who pushed her to enter a local craft fair, and who told her she had real talent. And Margaret had entered that fair, selling 3 pieces under a pseudonym, her maiden name, afraid I'd somehow find out and ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. She donated the money to a women's shelter. I never knew any of this. I was playing golf on those Saturdays, thinking about my swing and my handicap, while my wife was 40 minutes away creating a secret life out of clay and silence. But here's what made my chest ache as I read those entries. She wrote about wanting to tell me. Over and over, she'd write about coming home from the studio, her hands still smelling of clay despite washing them twice, and wanting to share her excitement with me, wanting to show me photos of what she'd made, and wanting to invite me to see her work. But she never did because, as she wrote in an entry from October 1996, Tom wouldn't understand. He'd smile and say it's nice and then make some joke about how we don't need more dishes. And he'd miss the entire point that this isn't about dishes. This is about me having something that makes me feel like Margaret instead of Tom's wife. He's not cruel. He's just incapable of seeing me as separate from the role I play in his life. I had to stop reading and put my head in my hands because the truth of her words cut deeper than any accusation could have. She was right. If she told me about pottery classes, I would have said exactly that. I would have made some joke about dishes or questioned why she needed a hobby when she already had book club and volunteering in the garden. I would have smiled and nodded and completely missed that she was trying to show me a piece of her soul. And she knew that about me. She knew me well enough to know I wouldn't understand, which meant I'd been predictable in my blindness, consistent in my failure to see her. How many other times had she wanted to share something with me and stopped herself, knowing I'd reduce it to something small and manageable instead of seeing it for what it really was? The journal entries continued chronologically, and I read about the years our children were in high school and college, the years I thought were our strongest because the chaos of young parenthood was behind us and we'd found our rhythm. Margaret wrote about those years very differently. She wrote about feeling invisible, about conversations where I'd talk about my work for 30 minutes while she listened, and then when she tried to share something about her day, I'd glance at the television or start reading the newspaper or check my watch and say I needed to make a phone call. She wrote about dinner parties where I'd interrupt her stories to correct small details or finish her sentences, and she'd just smile and let me because it was easier than the tension of calling me out. She wrote about feeling like a supporting actress in her own life, there to nod and agree and keep things running smoothly while everyone else got to be fully human and complex and interesting. She wrote about our son Michael's graduation from college in 1998, how proud I'd been, how I'd given this long speech at the celebration dinner about hard work and following your dreams, and how she'd sat there thinking about her own abandoned dreams of graduate school, the application she'd filled out in 1977 before we got engaged. An application she'd thrown away because I'd been clear that I wanted a traditional family, and she'd been young enough to think love meant sacrifice. I remembered that dinner. I remembered my speech. I thought it had been inspiring. Margaret wrote that night in her journal. Tom told Michael to follow his dreams, and I wonder if it ever occurs to him that I had dreams too, or if he thinks dreams are something only men have while women have preferences that can be negotiated away. I wanted to throw the journal across the attic. I wanted to argue with her words, defend myself, and explain that it wasn't like that. I had never told her she couldn't pursue her dreams, and she could have gone to graduate school if she'd wanted to, and I wouldn't have stopped her. But even as I formed these defenses in my mind, I heard how hollow they were. She never said she wanted graduate school because I'd made it clear without saying it directly that my career came first, my ambitions mattered most, and her job was to make sure the household ran smoothly so I could focus on building our future. Our future. Except it had been my future, and she'd just been infrastructure. The realization sat in my stomach like lead. I kept reading because what else could I do? Turn back time? Apologize to a ghost? The entries from the early 2000s showed Margaret building an entire parallel life I knew nothing about. After the pottery studio closed when Linda moved away, Margaret found other outlets. She volunteered at a women's shelter every Tuesday evening, the nights I had poker with my buddies from the firm. She told me she was attending a Bible study group. For 6 years, she spent Tuesday evenings helping women escape abusive marriages, listening to their stories, and helping them find resources and courage, and she never mentioned it once because, as she wrote, "Tom would ask too many questions about why I'm drawn to this work, and I don't want to examine too closely what it means that I find hope in helping women leave their husbands." That line made me physically cold. Was she comparing our marriage to abuse? I'd never raised a hand to Margaret, never called her names, never done any of the things those women at the shelter had endured. But as I kept reading, I understood she wasn't talking about that kind of abuse. She was talking about the slow erosion of self that happens when one person in a marriage gets to be fully themselves while the other person shrinks and accommodates, and disappears by degrees so gradual you don't notice until you look back and can't remember who you used to be. She wrote about a woman at the shelter named Patricia who said something that haunted Margaret for years. "My husband never hit me. He just made me feel like everything I wanted was unreasonable, everything I felt was too much, and everything I thought was silly. After 20 years, I didn't know who I was anymore. That's abuse too, even if it doesn't leave bruises you can see." Margaret wrote after hearing this. "I came home and looked at Tom reading his newspaper in his chair, and I thought, he's never hit me either. But has he ever really asked who I am? Or does he just assume he knows because I'm his wife? And wives are a category that doesn't require individual examination." I wanted to scream at the journal that I'd asked her. I'd talked to her every day, and we'd had conversations, entire decades of conversations. But had I asked her the right questions? Or had I just asked about dinner plans and whether she'd picked up my dry cleaning and what she thought about paint colors for the bathroom, treating her like a project manager for our household instead of a complex human being with an interior life that had nothing to do with me? The entries from our 30th anniversary, the trip to the coast I'd mentioned before, were devastating in their honesty. I'd given Margaret diamond earrings that year, expensive ones I'd saved for, thinking I was being romantic. She wrote, "Tom gave me diamond earrings today. Beautiful and expensive and exactly what he thinks I should want because they're the kind of thing a man gives his wife on a milestone anniversary. But I've been saving money from my library job for 2 years to buy a kiln. I want to fire my own pottery at home, want to have my hands in clay whenever the urge strikes, want to turn our garage into a studio. The kiln cost $2,000. The earrings cost $3,000. He spent $3,000 on jewelry I'll wear twice a year to fancy dinners instead of asking me what I actually wanted. He never asks what I dream about anymore. I'm not sure he ever really did." I remembered those earrings. I remembered being so proud of myself for the surprise, for remembering she'd admired similar ones at a jewelry store months before. But she'd been looking at them with me, playing the role of appreciative wife when I'd pointed them out, and I'd taken her polite agreement as genuine desire. I'd never asked what she'd buy if money were no object. I'd never asked what she dreamed about. I'd just assumed I knew because I'd been married to her for 30 years, and isn't that what marriage is? Knowing someone so well you don't have to ask? Except I hadn't known her at all. The journal had entries about our children too, and these were almost harder to read than the ones about our marriage. Margaret wrote about being proud of them but also deeply sad that our daughter Sarah was repeating patterns Margaret recognized from her own life. Sarah had given up a job opportunity in Boston to stay near her boyfriend, and Margaret had watched it happen with a sinking feeling she wrote about in long, anguished paragraphs. She tried to talk to Sarah, tried to gently suggest that maybe love shouldn't require geographic sacrifice, but Sarah had smiled and said it was fine. She preferred staying local anyway, and Margaret saw herself at 25 making the same calculations, convincing herself that what she was giving up wasn't that important compared to love and partnership and building a life with someone. Margaret wrote, "I want to grab Sarah by the shoulders and tell her that the small sacrifices add up, that one day she'll be 60 years old and won't remember what her own dreams were because she spent so long accommodating someone else's. But I can't say that without admitting I made the same mistakes, and I can't admit that without her asking why I stayed, why I'm still staying, and I don't have a good answer except that leaving feels impossible when you're this far in and you're this tired. This is tired." My vibrant, energetic wife, who gardened and volunteered and hosted family dinners, who everyone said had such a positive outlook, who seemed content and peaceful in our life together, was tired. Bone tired. Soul tired. Tired in a way I never saw because I wasn't looking for it. I realized I'd been crying without noticing, tears dripping onto the journal pages, and I wiped my face roughly with my sleeve because I didn't deserve to cry. Margaret was the one who'd suffered, who'd spent decades hiding and shrinking and pretending to be content while slowly suffocating. I was just a fool who'd been too comfortable, too certain, and too self-absorbed to notice my wife was drowning right in front of me. But the journal wasn't finished destroying me yet. The entries from the last 10 years, from our 60s into our early 70s, showed a different Margaret. She wrote less frequently, but when she did, there was a quality of acceptance mixed with deep melancholy. She'd stopped fighting, stopped wishing I would change or suddenly see her, and stopped hoping our marriage would transform into something where she felt fully alive. She'd made peace with her choices, or so she told herself, but the peace felt more like resignation, like a prisoner who stops rattling the bars because they've finally accepted the cage is permanent. She wrote about small acts of rebellion that kept her feeling human, buying books I'd think were frivolous and reading them in secret, taking long drives alone where she'd play music I didn't like and sing at the top of her lungs, and having deep conversations with women friends I barely knew existed because I'd never paid attention when she mentioned their names. She created a full life in the margins of our marriage, in the spaces I didn't occupy because I was watching sports or working in the yard or doing any of the 1,000 things I did while assuming Margaret was fine, Margaret was happy, and Margaret had everything she needed. In an entry from 2019, 5 years before she died, Margaret wrote about attending a poetry reading at the library and meeting a woman named Claire who reminded her of who she'd been at 23, full of passion and ideas and uncompromising in her authenticity. Margaret wrote, "Watching Claire recite her poetry with such confidence and fire, I felt grief wash over me so powerfully I had to leave the room. Not grief for who I am now, but grief for who I could have been if I'd had a fraction of her courage. If I'd said no sometimes instead of always yes. If I'd demanded space for myself instead of gracefully shrinking. If I'd married someone who wanted a partner instead of a wife, and there's a difference, though it took me 40 years to understand what that difference was. A partner instead of a wife." The words burned. Was that what I'd wanted? Not a partner but a wife, a role with specific duties and expectations, someone to manage the domestic sphere while I focused on everything I deemed important? When had I last asked Margaret about her thoughts on something that didn't directly involve household logistics? When had I last been curious about her inner life, her hopes, her fears, and the things that kept her awake at night? I couldn't remember. God help me, I couldn't remember a single instance. The journal entries became sparse in the final 2 years, just occasional updates. And then suddenly there were several entries close together from late 2023, right after Margaret's cancer diagnosis. I'd been dreading reaching these entries because I knew they'd be about dying, about fear and pain and loss, but what I found was somehow worse than I'd anticipated. Margaret didn't write much about being afraid of death itself. Instead, she wrote about being afraid of dying without ever having been fully known. November 14, 2023. The doctor says I have 8 months, maybe a year with treatment. Tom cried when we got home, held me, and told me he couldn't imagine life without me. But here's what I couldn't say. He's going to lose me, but he never really had all of me anyway. How do I tell him that I'm more afraid of dying with my truth still locked inside than I am of the cancer itself? December 3rd, 2023. I thought about telling Tom everything today. Just laying it all out, all the years of pretending and hiding and shrinking myself to fit into the shape he needed me to be. But what would be the point? It would destroy him to know how much of our marriage was my performance rather than my truth, and destroying him now, when I'm dying, feels cruel. So I'll take it to the grave. Maybe that's its own kind of sacrifice, protecting him from the truth even now. January 20th, 2024. Sarah asked me today what I wanted people to know about my life, what legacy I wanted to leave. I told her I wanted to be remembered as someone who loved her family and made a difference in her community, all the expected things. But what I wanted to say was this: I want women to know you can love someone and still lose yourself. You can have a good man and a good life and still feel like you're dying by degrees. You can do everything right according to everyone else's standards and still lie awake at night wondering who you might have been if you'd been brave enough to disappoint people. That's what I want my legacy to be. The truth. But I'm not brave enough even now. The pages blurred as I read through tears I couldn't control anymore. My wife had been dying and worried about legacy and truth, and I'd been focused on treatment schedules and keeping her comfortable and making sure our children didn't fall apart. Never once stopping to ask her the deeper questions. Never once creating space for her to tell me these things, even at the end. I'd been so busy trying to fix the unfixable problem of cancer that I'd missed the chance to finally know who my wife really was before I lost her. But there was one more entry, written just 2 weeks before Margaret died, and I almost couldn't bring myself to read it because I knew this was the end, the final words. The last chance she'd had to tell her truth, even if only to the pages of a hidden journal. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the book steady. February 10th, 2024. Dear Tom, if you're reading this journal, it means you found what I could never give you in person, the truth about who I really was beneath the role I played for 47 years. I need you to know I'm not writing this to hurt you. I'm writing this because I'm running out of time. And the weight of never having been fully honest is crushing me, and if I can't tell you to your face, at least I can tell you this way. You gave me a good life. Security, children I adore, a home, stability, all the things a woman of my generation was supposed to want. And I did want them, or I wanted to want them, and maybe that's the same thing in the end. But I also gave up dreams to fit into that life. And I chose to do so quietly rather than fight you for understanding because fighting seemed harder than accommodating, and by the time I realized how much of myself I'd surrendered, it felt too late to ask for it back. This isn't all your fault. I blame the era we grew up in, the roles we were taught, and the way I was raised to believe my value came from how well I supported my husband and raised my children rather than from any internal sense of self. I blame myself for not being braver, for not demanding you see me, for accepting comfortable numbness over risky authenticity. But I also blame you, Tom, and I need to say that clearly. I blame you for never being curious enough to ask me who I really was. I blame you for assuming you knew me completely because you'd been married to me so long. I blame you for making yourself the center of our life together and being content with me orbiting around you like a moon that exists only to reflect your light. I blame you for being comfortable when I was drowning. I don't know if you'll understand these words or if you'll get defensive and angry and throw this journal away after this page. But if you keep reading, if you can sit with the discomfort of knowing you failed me in ways you never acknowledged, then I want to tell you something important. It's not too late for you. You're going to survive me, probably by years given your family's health history. You're going to be lonely and sad and lost without me, but Tom, you're also going to have a chance I never took. A chance to grow. A chance to learn to really see people, to ask questions, and to make space for complexity. A chance to be better than you were with me. Don't let this break you, Tom. Let it open you. There's still time for you to really see people, to be curious about their interior lives, to understand that everyone you meet is as complicated and hidden as I was, and they're all hoping someone will care enough to ask the right questions. Honor me by doing what I couldn't do, live authentically. Ask people who they really are. Listen when they tell you. Make space for their whole selves, not just the parts that are convenient or easy. Be the man I needed you to be, even if you can't be it for me anymore. This is my final gift to you, the truth you never wanted to hear while I was alive. Don't waste it. All my love and all my hidden truth, Margaret. I sat in that attic as darkness fell completely, the journal open on my lap to those final words. And I understood that my wife had been teaching me even in death, leaving me this devastating curriculum about attention and curiosity, and the difference between comfort and true intimacy. She'd spent 47 years being invisible, and now she was forcing me to see her by showing me everything I'd missed. It was the kindest and cruelest gift I'd ever received. The question was, what would I do with it? Would I close this journal and convince myself that my version of our marriage was the real one, that Margaret had been content and these were just the private doubts everyone has, nothing serious, nothing that changed the fundamental truth of our good life together? Would I protect myself from the guilt and grief of knowing I'd failed her, failed to see her, and failed to be curious enough to discover the woman beneath the wife? Or would I keep reading? There were still pages left, still more truth to uncover, still more ways Margaret had hidden herself that I'd never suspected. Would I be brave enough to see all of it, to sit with the full weight of my blindness, to let this truth reshape everything I thought I knew about my life? And here's the question that terrified me most as I sat alone in that attic with my dead wife's secret journal. If I'd been this blind to Margaret, who else had I failed to see? My children? My friends? Every person I'd ever dismissed or interrupted or assumed I understood without bothering to ask? How many people in my 74 years had hidden themselves from me because I'd made it clear I wasn't interested in anything beneath the surface? I turned the page and kept reading because I owed her that much, but also because I was finally ready to ask the questions I should have been asking all along. Who was Margaret really? What had her days felt like? What had brought her joy that I never witnessed? What had broken her heart that I never noticed? Who had she been when she wasn't being my wife? I was about to find out, and I knew the answers would destroy the comfortable story I'd been telling myself about our marriage, about my life, and about the kind of husband and man I was. But maybe some stories need to be destroyed before truer ones can be built. Maybe being broken open is the only way to finally see clearly. So I kept reading as the attic grew dark around me, and with every page, every revelation, every hidden piece of Margaret's life I discovered, I felt my old self cracking apart, and I didn't try to stop it because Margaret was right. It wasn't too late for me, there was still time to be better, but only if I was willing to face how bad I'd been. Only if I was willing to sit with the devastating truth that the love of my life had spent decades wishing I'd love her enough to truly know her. And I had never even tried. So let me ask you something as I sit here in this darkness with this journal that's destroying and remaking me. When was the last time you asked someone you love who they really are? Not what they do or how they're feeling or what they need from the grocery store, but who they are beneath all the roles they play, all the expectations they meet, and all the ways they've learned to be acceptable instead of authentic. When was the last time you looked at someone you've known for years and realized you might not know them at all? Because I'm learning, too late to save my marriage but maybe not too late to save my soul, that love without curiosity isn't really love at all. It's just comfortable coexistence. And comfortable coexistence can last a lifetime, can look from the outside like a successful marriage, can produce children and grandchildren and 50th anniversary parties, and still be a tragedy of two people who never really met. I wasn't ready to face what else Margaret had hidden in this journal, but I was going to read it anyway. Because she'd asked me to. Because I owed her. Because maybe, just maybe, her truth could set me free. So here's what I want you to understand before I tell you how Margaret's journal changed me. Transformation doesn't happen in a single moment of revelation, like you see in the movies where someone has an epiphany and suddenly becomes a different person. Real change is messier, slower, and more painful than that. Real change requires you to sit with the worst truths about yourself until they stop being things that happen to you and start being things you're responsible for. And that process, that uncomfortable reckoning with who you've been and who you failed to be, That's where I spent the next several months of my life after I finally climbed down from that attic at 3 in the morning with Margaret's journal clutched against my chest like it was the most precious and most terrible thing I'd ever held. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I lay in the bed Margaret and I had shared for 47 years, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, and the silence in that room was deafening because for the first time since she died, I wasn't remembering the woman I thought I knew. I was mourning the woman I'd never let myself meet. There's a difference between grieving someone's death and grieving the relationship you never had with them, and the second grief is sharper because it comes with the knowledge that you could have done something about it if only you'd been paying attention, if only you'd been brave enough to ask the hard questions, if only you'd loved them enough to be curious about who they really were instead of comfortable with who you assumed them to be. The journal sat on Margaret's nightstand, right where she used to keep a glass of water and whatever book she was reading, and in the dim light from the street lamp outside I could see its worn leather cover, innocuous and devastating. I'd read every page, all the way to the end, and what I'd found in those final entries wasn't more secrets, or hidden resentments. What I'd found was something that broke my heart in an entirely different way, Margaret writing about small moments of joy I'd never noticed. Her Tuesday afternoons having tea with Helen, her best friend, where they talk about books and ideas and dreams. Her Saturday morning walks alone through the nature preserve, where she'd watch birds and feel connected to something larger than herself. Her volunteer work with literacy programs, where she taught adults to read and witness their transformation, made her feel useful in ways that had nothing to do with being a wife or mother. She'd built an entire life of meaning in the spaces I didn't occupy, and she'd been happy in those moments, genuinely happy, and I'd never seen it because I'd never looked. I'd been so focused on the parts of her life that intersected with mine that I'd completely missed the fact that she had a whole existence that had nothing to do with me. And reading about her joy in those independent moments didn't make me feel better. It made me feel worse because it meant she'd known how to be happy, she'd known how to be fulfilled, and she just couldn't be those things in the context of our marriage because I'd made no space for them. But here's what kept me awake that night. The question that circled my mind like a vulture over roadkill. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge now that I had it? Margaret was gone. I couldn't apologize to her, couldn't change how I'd treated her, and couldn't go back and be the husband she needed. The awareness came too late for our marriage. So was the point of her leaving me that journal just to torture me with regret? Was I supposed to spend whatever years I had left drowning in guilt for failures I could never repair? Or had she left it for some other reason, something I wasn't seeing yet in my grief and self-flagellation? I kept coming back to what she'd written in that final entry. Don't let this break you, Tom. Let it open you. There's still time for you to really see people. Still time. She believed there was still time for me to change, still time for me to become someone different, someone better. But was she right? Can a man at 74, after 7 decades of being a certain way, after 47 years of marriage spent being oblivious and self-centered and comfortable in his blindness, actually transform into someone who sees people, who asks questions, who makes space for complexity? I didn't know. But lying there in that dark bedroom with dawn still hours away, I decided I had to try because the alternative was spending whatever time I had left being the same man who'd failed Margaret, and I couldn't stomach that. I owed her better, even if better came too late for her to witness it. Maybe especially because it came too late. Maybe the only way to honor her truth was to let it remake me. So when the sun finally rose that morning, I did something I'd never done in my entire adult life. I called in sick to my volunteer position at the community center, where I'd been helping with tax preparation for seniors. I never missed a scheduled day and prided myself on being reliable. But that morning I realized reliability without presence is just showing up to perform a role, and I was done performing roles. I needed time to figure out who I was going to be now that I knew who I'd been, and that required more than a few hours between commitments. I spent that first week doing something that probably sounds simple but felt revolutionary. I sat with discomfort. Every time I wanted to distract myself by turning on the television or going through emails or finding some task to occupy my hands, I forced myself to just sit and feel the weight of what I'd learned. I let myself remember specific moments from my marriage through the new lens Margaret had given me, and it was excruciating. I remembered the time she tried to tell me about a book she'd read that moved her, and I'd said, "That's nice, honey," without even looking up from the newspaper. I remembered our 30th anniversary dinner, where I'd talked for 20 minutes about a difficult client at work, and when she'd started to tell me about something happening at the library, I checked my watch and signaled for the check because I wanted to get home in time for a basketball game on television. I remembered 1,000 small moments of dismissal and interruption and assumption, and I had to face the fact that each one had told Margaret the same message: "You're not that interesting, your thoughts aren't that important, and your inner life doesn't require my attention." How do you live with that knowledge about yourself? How do you reconcile being a person who thought of themselves as good and kind and loving with the reality that you treated the person you claimed to love most like wallpaper, just a background presence you stopped noticing because it was always there? You sit with it. You let it hurt. You resist the urge to explain it away or minimize it or blame circumstances. You look directly at your failures until they become impossible to deny, and then, if you're very lucky and very determined, you start to ask yourself what comes next. What came next for me was deciding to tell someone the truth. I couldn't keep this inside, couldn't process it alone, but I also couldn't tell just anyone because this wasn't the kind of thing you casually mentioned at coffee or shared with acquaintances who'd just offer platitudes about how I was being too hard on myself. I needed to tell someone who'd loved Margaret, who'd understand what this meant, who'd hold me accountable to actually changing instead of just feeling bad for a while and then slipping back into old patterns. I called Sarah, my daughter, and asked if she could come over. She arrived within an hour, concerned because I never called her in the middle of a weekday and never asked her to drop everything and visit. She walked into the house with worry written across her face, probably expecting me to tell her I'd been diagnosed with something terminal, and in a way I suppose I had been. I'd been diagnosed with the terminal illness of self-awareness arriving decades too late. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret used to write in her public journal, while her coffee went cold, and I told Sarah everything. I showed her the hidden journal, explained how I'd found it, and then I read her some of the entries. Not all of them, some were too private, too raw, but enough that Sarah could understand what I'd discovered about my marriage and about myself. I watched my daughter's face as I read, watched her expression shift from confusion to recognition to something that looked like grief mixed with validation, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long time, just staring at her hands folded on the table. "Did you know?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know your mother felt this way?" Sarah looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and what she said next nearly destroyed me. "I knew Mom wasn't happy the way you thought she was. I didn't know specifics, didn't know about the journal or Daniel or any of the details, but I knew she was lonely. I could see it, Dad. We all could. Mom had this look sometimes, this faraway sadness when she thought no one was watching, and I used to ask her about it when I was a teenager. She'd always smile and say she was fine, just tired, but I knew it was more than that. And I felt angry at you. If I'm being honest, angry that you didn't see it, but I also felt like it wasn't my place to say anything because it was your marriage, and Mom never complained about you, never said anything critical, so what was I supposed to do? Hearing that my children had known, had watched their mother be lonely, and had felt helpless to change it added another layer of anguish to everything I was feeling. But there was also something clarifying about it because it meant this wasn't just my distorted perception, or Margaret being overly dramatic in a private journal. Other people had seen what I'd missed. The evidence of my blindness existed outside my own guilty conscience. "Why are you showing me this now?" Sarah asked, and I could hear the edge in her voice, the question beneath the question. Why are you making me complicit in this painful knowledge? Why am I being asked to hold your guilt along with my own grief for Mom? "Because I need help," I said, and saying those 3 words felt like stepping off a cliff. I need help becoming someone different, someone who actually sees people and asks questions and makes space for who they really are. And I need you to hold me accountable because left to my own devices, I'll convince myself I've changed when I've probably just gotten better at performing change. Your mother trusted you with her real self in ways she didn't trust me. I need you to teach me how to earn that kind of trust." Sarah started crying then, really crying, and she reached across the table and took my hand, and we sat there together in the kitchen while she grieved her mother and I grieved the husband I'd been, and it was the most honest moment my daughter and I had ever shared. Up until that point, my relationship with my children had been loving but surface level. I was the dad who showed up to important events and gave advice about practical matters and helped with house projects when they needed an extra pair of hands. But I'd never been vulnerable with them, never admitted failure or asked for help, or let them see me as anything other than the competent patriarch who had everything figured out. That day marked the beginning of something new between us, something more real, and it started with me being willing to show my daughter the worst parts of myself and ask her to help me do better. Over the next several weeks, Sarah became my guide in learning how to actually see people. She'd come over twice a week, and we practiced what she called radical curiosity. She'd ask me about people in my life, friends from church or neighbors or the other volunteers at the community center, and when I'd give surface-level descriptions, she'd push me deeper. "But what do you think matters to them? What do you think keeps them up at night? What do you think they dream about?" And I'd realize I had no idea. I'd known these people for years, some of them for decades, and I couldn't answer basic questions about their inner lives because I'd never asked, never wondered, and never been curious enough to look past the roles they played. Sarah taught me how to ask open-ended questions and then actually listen to the answers instead of waiting for my turn to talk. She taught me how to notice when someone's words didn't match their body language, and how to create space for people to share more than just the acceptable surface story. She taught me that curiosity is an act of love, that really asking someone about themselves and then paying attention to their answer is one of the most generous things you can do. But knowing how to do something and actually doing it are different things, and my first attempts at being genuinely curious with people were awkward and uncomfortable. I'd ask questions that were too personal too quickly, or I'd ask questions but then immediately jump in with my own opinions instead of just listening, or I'd ask questions but not follow up on the answers because I got distracted by my own thoughts. It was humbling to discover at 74 that I was fundamentally bad at something as basic as having a real conversation with another human being. But I kept trying. I started with Helen, Margaret's best friend, inviting her over for tea and asking her to tell me about my wife from her perspective. Helen was wary at first, protective of Margaret even in death, but when I explained about the journal and admitted how badly I'd failed Margaret, something in Helen softened. She told me stories about Margaret I'd never heard, about the dreams she'd confided and the frustrations she'd shared and the version of herself she'd been able to be when I wasn't around. And instead of getting defensive or making excuses, I just listened, really listened, and let Helen's words paint a picture of my wife that was more complete and more true than the one I'd carried for 47 years. At one point Helen said something that shifted how I understood everything. "Margaret loved you, Tom. I want you to know that. She really did love you. But she also knew you were only capable of loving the version of her you could understand, so she only showed you that version. It wasn't your fault that you didn't know her completely, but it also wasn't not your fault. You created an environment where only certain parts of her were welcome, and she adapted to survive in that environment. That's what women of our generation learn to do." That phrase, adapted to survive, clarified something I'd been struggling with. Margaret hadn't been deliberately deceptive or manipulative by hiding parts of herself. She'd been doing what countless women in her generation had been conditioned to do, making themselves smaller and more palatable so their marriages could function smoothly, so their husbands could feel competent and in control, so the domestic sphere could remain peaceful even if that peace came at the cost of authenticity. She'd been surviving, and I'd been comfortable in that survival arrangement because it asked nothing of me except that I remain exactly who I'd always been. I asked Helen if she thought Margaret had been happy, even with everything she'd hidden and sacrificed, and Helen was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think Margaret found happiness in moments, in small rebellions and secret joys and relationships where she could be more fully herself. I think she made peace with her choices and found meaning in her life despite the constraints of your marriage. But do I think she lived the fullest expression of who she could have been? No. And I think she knew that, and I think it made her sad in a way. She learned to carry so gracefully that most people never noticed the weight. That conversation with Helen broke something open in me, some last defensive wall that wanted to believe Margaret had been fine, that our marriage had been good enough, and that my failures weren't really that bad. Helen's gentle honesty demolished those comforting lies and left me with the stark truth. I'd been married to a woman who learned to carry sadness so gracefully I never saw it, and that was a devastating indictment of my attention, my curiosity, and my love. But Helen also gave me something precious that afternoon: permission to grow. Margaret would want you to be better now, she told me as she was leaving. She'd want this knowledge to transform you rather than destroy you. Don't waste her truth by just feeling guilty about it. Honor it by becoming the kind of person who would have seen her if you'd met today. Becoming the kind of person who would have seen her. That became my North Star, the question I asked myself in every interaction. Would the person I'm being right now have seen Margaret? Would this version of me have been curious enough, attentive enough, and humble enough to ask her who she really was and then actually care about the answer? Most days, the answer was still no. Change is slow, and 7 decades of habits don't dissolve just because you want them to. But some days, I'd catch myself actually listening to someone without simultaneously composing my response in my head. Some days, I'd ask a follow-up question instead of changing the subject back to myself. Some days, I'd notice that someone seemed sad or distant, and I'd ask about it instead of pretending not to see. Small victories, barely worth mentioning, but for me they were revolutionary because they meant I was becoming capable of doing what had been impossible for me before: paying attention to someone else's interior life. I started having real conversations with my son Michael, asking him about his marriage and actually listening when he talked about the challenges he and his wife were facing. I'd always dismiss relationship problems as things people just had to work through on their own, figuring if I gave practical advice about communication or compromise, that was enough. But when I asked Michael what scared him most about his marriage and then sat quietly while he told me about his fear of becoming like me, of waking up one day and realizing he'd been married to a stranger because he never bothered to stay curious, I understood that what people need isn't advice, it's witness. They need someone to hear their truth without trying to fix it or minimize it or make it about themselves. My relationship with my youngest, Rebecca, transformed too. She'd always been the most distant of our children, calling dutifully but never staying on the phone long, visiting for holidays but always seeming eager to leave. I'd chalked it up to her being busy with her own life, never considering that maybe she was distant because I'd never given her reason to be close. So I called her one evening, and instead of the usual surface-level check-in, I asked her something I'd never asked before. Do you feel like I know you? Do you feel like I understand who you are and what matters to you? The silence on the other end of the phone was so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Then Rebecca said very quietly, "Dad, I've been out to you 3 times, and you've changed the subject every single time. Do you even remember that I'm gay?" I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Of course I remembered. Or did I? I had some vague memory of a conversation years ago, but I'd filed it away as unimportant and not relevant to how I thought about my daughter, and in doing so I told her that a fundamental part of her identity didn't matter to me. I told her she wasn't worth knowing fully. I'd done to my own daughter exactly what I'd done to Margaret, and the realization made me physically sick. "I'm sorry," I said, and I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as I stood in my kitchen at 74 years old, finally understanding how many people I'd failed through my selfish inattention. "I'm so sorry, Rebecca. You're right. I didn't pay attention. I didn't want to deal with anything that made me uncomfortable, so I just pretended not to hear you, and that was cruel and cowardly, and I'm sorry. Tell me now. Tell me everything I should have asked about years ago. I'm ready to listen. I'm finally ready to know you." And Rebecca did. She told me about her partner of 5 years, a woman I'd never met because I'd never asked to meet her. She told me about the pain of feeling invisible in her own family, of watching her siblings bring partners to holidays while she came alone because she'd learned not to expect acceptance. She told me about the version of herself she'd hidden from me because she'd known I wasn't capable of handling her truth. That conversation lasted 3 hours, and by the end of it, I'd met my daughter for the first time in her 38 years of life. We made plans for me to meet her partner the following weekend, and when I hung up the phone, I sat in the silence of my empty house and understood viscerally what Margaret had tried to tell me in her journal. When you love someone but never bother to know them, you're not really loving them at all. You're loving a version of them you've invented, and the real person is left alone with their truth, unseen and unknown. How many people had I done this to over the course of my life? How many coworkers and friends and neighbors and family members had I interacted with for years without ever truly seeing them? The weight of that question was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to carry it because that weight was the only thing keeping me moving forward, the only thing preventing me from sliding back into the comfortable blindness I'd inhabited for 7 decades. I went back to volunteering at the community center, but I showed up differently. Instead of just efficiently processing tax forms, I started asking the seniors I was helping about their lives. Really asking. What had they done before retirement? What did they miss? What brought them joy now? What worried them? And people, starved for someone to be genuinely curious about them, opened up in ways that surprised me. I heard stories about lost loves and abandoned dreams and unexpected joys and complicated relationships with children who'd stopped calling. I heard about loneliness and fear and hope and resilience. I heard the full texture of human lives, and it was overwhelming and beautiful and heartbreaking. One woman, Charlotte, told me she'd been married for 56 years and her husband had died 2 months ago, and when I asked her how she was really doing, not the polite, "I'm fine," but the real truth, she started crying and said, "I miss him terribly, but I also feel guilty because part of me feels relief, and what kind of monster feels relieved that her husband is dead?" And instead of shutting down that honesty or telling her not to feel that way, I asked her why she felt relief, and she told me about how her husband had made all the decisions for 5 decades, how she'd never been allowed to have opinions about anything important, how she'd spent so long being his wife that she'd forgotten who she was underneath. And I thought about Margaret. I thought about how she might have felt relief at moments too, relief when I was gone for the weekend or working late, relief to have space to be herself without having to perform the role of my wife. And I told Charlotte about Margaret's journal, about discovering too late that my own wife had felt similarly constrained, and Charlotte and I sat in that community center and cried together about marriages that looked successful from the outside but felt suffocating on the inside, about the price women paid for domestic peace, and about the transformation that becomes possible only after the relationship ends. That moment with Charlotte was when I fully understood what Margaret had meant about there still being time for me. She hadn't just meant time to be better in some abstract sense. She'd meant time to offer other people what I'd never offered her, genuine witness, real curiosity, and space to be fully human. Every interaction was an opportunity to do for someone else what I'd failed to do for Margaret, and that didn't erase my failure with her, but it meant her suffering could have meaning if I let it teach me how to be present for others. I started writing letters to Margaret in the back of her journal, a practice Sarah suggested when I told her I kept having conversations with my wife in my head. The letters weren't apologies, not exactly, though there was plenty of sorry woven through them. Mostly they were updates, telling her about how I was changing, about the people I was learning to see, and about the way her truth was remaking me from the inside out. I told her about meeting Rebecca's partner, Emily, and how I'd asked Emily questions about herself and actually listened to the answers, and how Rebecca had hugged me afterward with tears in her eyes. I told her about the conversation with Charlotte, and how I'd been able to offer comfort because I finally understood what Charlotte had experienced. I told her about the pottery kiln I'd ordered, the same model she'd wanted, and how I'd donated it to the community center in her name so other people could create beauty with their hands the way she'd never been able to do at home. Writing those letters became a spiritual practice, a way of staying accountable to the transformation I'd committed to. Every time I was tempted to slip back into old patterns, to stop paying attention or make something about myself or assume I understood without asking, I'd think about having to write Margaret that evening and tell her I'd failed again, and that thought would pull me back to presence. Months passed, and I started to notice something unexpected. I was less lonely. For years after Margaret died, I'd been drowning in loneliness despite being surrounded by people, despite having children who called and neighbors who checked in and a full calendar of volunteer commitments. But that loneliness had been the loneliness of a person who's never truly connected with anyone, who's spent decades in the company of others without ever really meeting them. Now, as I learned to be genuinely curious and present, as I practiced asking questions and listening to answers and seeing people's full humanity, I started experiencing real connection for the first time in my life. And real connection, I discovered, is the opposite of loneliness even when you're alone. I started attending a grief support group that met Tuesday evenings at the church. The same evening Margaret had volunteered at the women's shelter while telling me she was at Bible study. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd started by just listening to other people share about their losses, but eventually I told my own story, not just about Margaret dying but about discovering I'd never really known her. I talked about the journal and the secrets, and the devastating realization that I'd failed the person I loved most. And instead of the judgment I'd feared, what I received was recognition. Almost everyone in that room had similar stories about discovering too late that they'd missed something crucial, that they'd been blind to someone's pain or need or truth. We were a room full of people learning to live with regret while also choosing not to let that regret define the rest of our lives. One man in the group, James, became a close friend, something I'd never really had before. I'd had golfing buddies and colleagues and people I'd known for decades, but never a friend in the truest sense, someone I could be vulnerable with, someone who knew my worst moments, and chose to keep showing up anyway. James had lost his wife the year before, and he'd discovered after her death that she'd been depressed for years and he'd never noticed because he'd been too focused on his own career and interests. We'd meet for coffee once a week and talk about our failures and our attempts at growth and the strange experience of becoming better men after it was too late for our wives to benefit from that growth. "Do you think they know?" James asked me once. "Do you think our wives can somehow see that we're trying to be different now?" I didn't know how to answer that. I'm not sure what I believe about what happens after death, whether there's consciousness or awareness or any ability to witness the living. But I told James what I'd come to believe about the purpose of our transformation. Whether they know it or not, we owe it to them to be better. We owe it to them to let their truth matter enough to change us. And we owe it to everyone still living in our lives to offer them what we failed to offer our wives: real attention, genuine curiosity, and space to be fully themselves. That conversation happened almost 8 months after I'd found Margaret's journal, and it marked a shift from the raw, desperate grief of those early months to something more settled and purposeful. I was still sad about what I'd lost and what I'd never had with Margaret, but that sadness had been joined by something else: determination to make sure her suffering had meaning, to make sure her truth didn't die with her but instead became the catalyst for me finally learning how to love people properly. And then, almost a year to the day after I'd found the journal, I received a letter that changed everything again. It arrived in the mail with no return address, just my name and address written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "Dear Tom, you don't know me, but I knew Margaret. We worked together at the women's shelter for 6 years. She talked about you sometimes, and I want you to know she loved you despite everything. But I also want you to know she was planning to leave you. She'd started saving money secretly, had looked into apartments, had even picked a date, June 15th, 2024. But then she got her cancer diagnosis in October of 2023, and she decided to stay because she didn't want you to be alone while she was dying. I thought you should know that her choice to stay wasn't just about history or obligation. It was also an act of kindness toward you, even though you'd never been as kind to her. She was an extraordinary woman, and I hope you're honoring her memory by being better than you were. Sincerely, Patricia." I read that letter 5 times, my hands shaking harder with each reading. Margaret had been planning to leave me. After 47 years, after decades of accommodating and hiding and making peace with her choices, she'd finally decided to choose herself. She'd been months away from walking out the door, from starting over at 73 years old, from finally living authentically even if it meant losing everything she'd built. And then cancer had stolen that choice from her, and she'd stayed not because she wanted to but because she'd been too kind to abandon me while facing death. The revelation broke me open all over again, but differently this time. In the beginning, I'd grieved discovering I hadn't known Margaret. Now I grieved, knowing she'd been so close to freedom and then lost it. I grieved that even her final choice to stay had been shaped by putting my needs before her own. I grieved that she died without ever experiencing what it felt like to live fully for herself. But I also felt something unexpected: gratitude. Gratitude that even at the end, even after everything, Margaret had cared enough about me to protect me from being alone in her dying. She could have left, could have told me she was done, and could have spent her final months in her own apartment living whatever version of authentic life she had time for. Instead, she'd stayed and tended to me while cancer ravaged her body, and I'd never known I was being given a gift I didn't deserve. That letter from Patricia became the final piece of Margaret's truth, the completion of the story I'd been learning through her journal. And it clarified for me what I needed to do next. I gathered my children together, all three of them, and I gave them their mother's journal to read. It was time for them to know who she really was, not just the mother who'd loved them and sacrificed for them, but the full, complex woman who'd had dreams and disappointments, and an entire interior life they'd never fully known. They deserved to inherit her truth, deserved to learn from her experience, and deserved to understand the cost of living inauthentically so they could make different choices in their own lives and relationships. We spent a weekend together reading and talking and crying and processing. Sarah admitted she'd always felt pressure to be the perfect daughter, and always sensed she was supposed to make up for Mom's sacrifices by being successful and grateful. Michael talked about how he'd learned from watching our marriage that men were supposed to lead and women were supposed to follow, and how that had damaged his own marriage until his wife threatened to leave and forced him to see her as an equal partner. Rebecca talked about how Mom's inability to be fully herself had taught Rebecca to hide too, to assume that authenticity wasn't safe, that being fully known was too risky. And we all committed, together, to doing better. To ask questions and listen to answers. To make space for complexity and contradiction. To loving people enough to be curious about who they really are instead of comfortable with who we assume them to be. That's what Margaret's journal gave us in the end. Not just guilt or grief or regret, though we felt all of those things, but a roadmap for how to love better, how to see more clearly, and how to honor the people in our lives by being brave enough to know them. I'm 75 now, a year older than I was when I found that journal in the attic, and I'm a different man than I was then. I'm still learning, still failing sometimes, still catching myself falling into old patterns of self-centeredness and assumption. But I'm trying in ways I never tried before, and that trying matters because it's created space for real relationships to develop where only shallow connections existed before. I think about Margaret every day, but the grief has shifted from paralyzing to purposeful. I miss her. God, how I miss her. But I also feel grateful that she loved me enough to leave me the truth even knowing it would hurt. She could have taken all those secrets to the grave, could have let me continue believing our marriage was exactly what I thought it was, and could have protected me from the pain of self-knowledge. Instead, she gave me the gift of seeing clearly, even though clear sight revealed how blind I'd been. And I'm using that gift. Every day, in small ways and large ones, I'm choosing to see people. I'm choosing to ask questions. I'm choosing to listen with my full attention instead of just waiting to talk. I'm choosing to make space for other people's authentic selves even when that authenticity is uncomfortable, or inconvenient, or challenges how I want to see the world. Is it enough? Does it make up for 47 years of failing Margaret? No. Nothing could make up for that. But it means her suffering wasn't meaningless. It means her truth is living on through me and through our children, changing how we move through the world, affecting everyone we encounter. It means that a woman who felt invisible for most of her life is now being seen, really seen, even in death, and her story is teaching other people to see more clearly too. That's the legacy she deserves, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure she gets it. So I'm asking you now, whoever you are listening to this story, to do something for me, for Margaret, for everyone who's ever felt unseen in their most important relationships. Look at the people you love, the people you think you know so well, and ask yourself honestly, do I really know them? Have I been curious enough, attentive enough, and humble enough to discover who they are beneath the roles they play? Have I created space for them to show me their full selves, or have I only made room for the parts of them that are convenient and comfortable, and don't challenge my assumptions? And if the answer is no, if you realize you've been living with someone for years without truly knowing them, don't wait until they're gone to start paying attention. Don't wait for a hidden journal, or a deathbed revelation, or some crisis that forces you to see what you've been missing. Start today. Right now. Ask the people in your life who they really are, and then listen, really listen, to what they tell you. Ask what they dream about, what scares them, what brings them joy, and what makes them feel most alive. Ask about the parts of themselves they've learned to hide, the dreams they've given up, and the person they might have been in different circumstances. And when they tell you, don't minimize it or fix it or make it about yourself. Just witness them. Just see them. Just let them know that who they really are matters more than who you need them to be. Because here's what I've learned in this year of painful transformation. Love without curiosity isn't really love. It's just comfortable coexistence. And comfortable coexistence can last a lifetime, can produce children and anniversaries and what looks from the outside like a successful relationship, and still be a tragedy of two people who never really met. Don't let that be your story. Don't let the people you love die without ever feeling truly known by you. Don't wait for a hidden journal to teach you what you should have been learning all along. Margaret's truth broke me, but it also freed me. It showed me that it's never too late to become someone who sees people, who asks questions, and who makes space for the full, complicated, beautiful humanity of everyone they encounter. I'm 75 years old, and I'm just now learning how to really pay attention, how to really listen, and how to really love people by being curious about who they are instead of comfortable with who I assume them to be. If I can change at 75, after 7 decades of being oblivious and self-centered and blind, then anyone can change. Anyone can choose to start seeing. Anyone can decide that today is the day they stop assuming and start asking. So here's my challenge to you, and I mean this seriously. I want you to take action on this. Before this week is over, I want you to have a real conversation with someone you love. Not a surface-level check-in, not a discussion about schedules or logistics or practical matters, but a real conversation where you ask them something you've never asked before, something that requires them to share more than just the acceptable surface story. Ask them what they've given up to be in their current life. Ask them what version of themselves they hide. Ask them what they'd do if they weren't afraid of disappointing anyone. Ask them what they wish you understood about them that you've never seemed to notice. And then, and this is the crucial part, just listen. Don't interrupt. Don't offer solutions. Don't change the subject back to yourself. Just listen with your full attention and let them feel what it's like to be truly seen by someone who claims to love them. And after you've had that conversation, I want you to come back and tell me about it. Leave a comment sharing what you learned, what surprised you, and what you discovered about someone you thought you knew completely. Not to perform a connection or prove you did the assignment, but because sharing these stories creates a community of people committed to seeing each other more clearly. And we need that community because this work of really knowing people is hard and uncomfortable and goes against every instinct we have to protect ourselves by staying surface level. I'll be reading every comment. I'll be witnessing your attempts at transformation the way I wish I'd witnessed Margaret's full humanity when I had the chance. And maybe together, through our collective commitment to seeing people more clearly, we can create a world where fewer people have to hide who they really are, where fewer people die feeling unseen, and where fewer people leave behind hidden journals full of truths they were too afraid to speak out loud. Margaret's story doesn't have to be just her story. It can be the beginning of something larger, a movement of people choosing curiosity over comfort, presence over performance, and real intimacy over easy coexistence. But it only becomes that if you act. If you take this story and let it change how you show up in your relationships. If you let Margaret's truth teach you what her truth taught me, That every person you encounter is as complicated and hidden and hungry to be truly known as she was, and they're all hoping someone will care enough to ask the right questions. Will you be that someone? Will you honor Margaret's memory and her suffering by being for someone else what I failed to be for her? Will you choose, starting today, to really see the people you love? That's the wisdom Margaret left me, purchased at the cost of a lifetime of hiding and a death full of regret for authenticity never risked. Don't let that be your legacy. Don't let that be the legacy you force on the people who love you. There's still time. There's still time to ask. There's still time to listen. There's still time to know and be known. But only if you start now. So go. Close this video. Find someone you love. Ask them who they really are. And then come back and tell me what you learned. I'll be waiting. We'll all be waiting. A community of people learning together to see more clearly, to love more fully, and to honor the Margarets of the world by making sure no one else has to hide their truth because they don't believe anyone cares enough to discover it. This is how we change. Not in grand gestures or dramatic transformations, but in small acts of genuine curiosity, repeated over and over until they become our new way of being in the world. This is how we honor the dead, by being better to the living. This is how we love, by being brave enough to really know. Margaret taught me that. Now I'm teaching you. What you do with that teaching is up to you. But please, please don't waste it. Don't waste her truth. Don't waste your time. Don't waste the people in your life by never bothering to discover who they really are. Start today. Ask the questions. Listen to the answers. See the people you love while there's still time to let them know they're seen. That's my story. That's Margaret's gift. That's the wisdom I'm leaving with you. Now go. And when you come back, tell me what you discovered. I promise you, it will change everything.